Welcome to the Medical Collective, your go-to podcast where medicine meets real life. I'm Dr. Keisha Davis, a pathologist, personal trainer, and your host. I will be joined by a vibrant team of doctors who are not just healthcare professionals, but artists, fitness enthusiasts, and advocates for change. Each episode, we dive deep into the world of medicine, from untold stories of the healthcare industry to the latest in medical advancements. We're here to bring your insights, answer your burning questions, and explore the art and science of healing. So let's get started and step into the world of the Medical Collective. Welcome to the Medical Collective. I'm so excited because this episode we have our new co-host, Dr. Leslie Ann, with us, and all the amazing Dr. Sharon, Dr. Atoosa, and Dr. Dan. So we're going to meet Dr. Leslie Ann because you guys have not met her yet. So Dr. Leslie Ann, introduce yourself.
Well, I am Dr. Leslie Ann Williams. I'm board-certified internal medicine and pediatrics, and I have been practicing for a while. I started a primary care practice in the U.S. Virgin Islands and throughout the Caribbean. I went there because there was a great need. And as we're talking about hurricanes today, one of my roles there in the USVI was really disaster relief and served on the governor's task force in really streamlining the services during disasters and finding better methods and methodologies to deliver healthcare during times of disaster. I am an artist. I do paint, I dance, I sing, I act. So multi-hyphenated Renaissance kind of gal, and I have used art in my medicine because I found that art is actually healing. And interestingly enough, there is a discussion at the Kennedy Center with regards to art in medicine. So right up my alley. I have also and continue to do work with some of the embassies around town here in Washington, D.C., and usually serve as a consultant and a voice on Capitol Hill when it comes to medicine and medical advocacy issues. I'll say that. We have got a lot of things that we need to do as a practice of physicians. So my work and advocacy through the American College of Physicians is something that I take really seriously. And finally, well, there's a lot to say about me, but I will add that I am also one of the American College of Physicians coaches. So I do coach physicians as well as other doctor groups, if you will, into kind of getting to the next step and getting, so that's really rewarding. My mentees have been doing an excellent job with fulfilling their goals as it relates to medicine. And I would also add that in my role as well in the ACP that I have done wellness coaching. And so many times we have presentation at our annual conferences, and so I do participate in our wellness coaching as well.
That's great.
There, you'll know more later.
Yeah, because I'm like, there's a lot more to tell that Dr. Leslie Ann has not told you, but you will be able to contact actually and look at the doctors at the show notes. So Dr. Leslie Ann will have a website there, and you'll be able to click on it to find out more about her. But I wanted to get into something today. We're all looking at the news because there's a hurricane coming upon Florida. And the last time, 2 shows ago, you remember we were talking about the other hurricane, Helene. Now, there is an article out before we get into disaster preparedness that is in Newsweek, and it's in NBC, and they were talking about these IV fluid shortages. The problem is that one of the companies in Florida that provides IV fluids has been down since Helene, and Imagine now is still down. So now a lot of hospitals are really trying to curtail and figure out what to do with the IV fluids. So I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts about this. Have you heard about it?
I actually didn't hear about it, but it's very reminiscent of what we went through in St. Thomas. And being an island, it's insulated. So we had planes coming down from a couple charity organizations, but also Bloomberg sent down planes, and we got donations of lots of IV fluids, which was a major thing as well. So I think this is when the rest of the country have to step in and send IV fluids. So, but I have not heard about that, but not at all surprising. This is par for the course with back-to-back Category 5 or 4 and 5 hurricanes. Irma and Maria was Category 5, and it was 2 weeks apart, and that devastating many of our islands, as Dr. Sharon would remember.
Yeah. And something else that they mentioned is other hospitals, not just in Florida, but in Virginia and other places, are not doing a lot of elective surgeries to halt the need of using IV fluid. So it's very, very sad. Anyone else?
Yes, I can definitely see where, a shortage of IV fluids will affect patient care in terms of even delaying, elective surgeries, and quote unquote elective surgeries are surgeries that are not emergencies. Elective procedures are procedures that are not emergencies. Something that will be an emergency, it will be a patient who's hemorrhaging who would need IV fluid. In my case, a pregnant patient who comes in and need IV fluids. So I can see where that will definitely affect patient care. And also from what I was reading, hospitals don't tend to stack like an endless supply of IV fluids because they do expire pretty quickly. So you don't want to have a stack of 6-7 months worth of IV fluid. However, maybe we can learn something from this, where we're in hurricane-prone regions, maybe we need to at least have a 3-month supply on hand. Because, like, for example, I'm in Houston, we're hurricane-prone. So definitely that is affecting practices in hospitals here. So maybe, like in terms of disaster planning ahead, we know that, from the start of hurricane season, we may need an additional whatever with maybe expiration date to December to hold us over in the event of a hurricane season. And then maybe if we have an excess and then somewhere like Florida has a hurricane or somewhere else, we can always help another state. That's just a thought. And I know Dr. Dan is ER, so I know he has something to say about this.
I'm waiting for Dr. Dan to say something. Before we get to Dr. Dan, let me throw a little wrench into it. We heard this before with masks and gloves. Now there's a gray market where people online are selling IV fluids that say they have them. Hospitals are not buying them from there, but be aware, you guys, you cannot get IV fluids from a market online. Go ahead, Dr. Dan.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to all what you all said. The important part is with people actually having their own supplies. The main supplies that they need to have, they sometimes don't even get. So I'm talking about people with chronic diseases who have their own medication that need to be refilled. So during the hurricane season or whatever disaster that could come up, in your own region, people need to anticipate that. So that means like getting a 90-day supply. And this is actually the guidance that was put out by DHS FEMA way back as we're doing disaster planning. Then your continuity of operations, meaning how do you resupply your hospital, your staff, or your business. This goes down even to the small level of your individual own business and to your medical needs. So yeah, there are a lot of things. And then within the ER, of course, most of the patients we're seeing are trauma, they're injured, they need IV fluids, they're dehydrated. So yeah, we've been playing musical chairs and trying to figure out supply. Fortunately, we've had some other vendors who are local who may be able to supply us with some IV fluids, but it's definitely had an impact on other hospitals, and we've talked about it and even sharing resources. So it reminds us again that disasters are, day-to-day preparedness begets disaster preparedness, as one of my colleagues says. That is important. So it's what we do in our day-to-day that gets us ready for when something really bad happens. And unfortunately, this is not just the end, but the beginning of all of this, especially with climate change and all the other things that we're seeing.
Great information, everyone. And it's kind of preempting us and getting us ready for this conversation. We're going to put the disaster preparedness into 3 parts. So preparation, as well as what happens immediately after the disaster. And we know that one is coming towards Florida, and the long-term effect. I think people don't think about the long-term effect that you have to get ready for when you're dealing with a disaster. So first of all, I want to give some stats. And also, we've heard in the news about FEMA, the Federal Emergency Administration. And the problem is that there's been a lot of rumors about what they are and aren't doing. We won't get into all of those, but I will have a link to FEMA's response, their rumor response, which is great. They talked about the myths and they went through each one of them and what's really happening on the ground. But as far as pre-disaster preparedness, right now with statistics, according to FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, only 57% of Americans have supplies set aside for disasters. 57%. It's much of a concern, and I think a lot of things can arise from that when you're not prepared for it. So let's talk about personal preparedness. How does one person prepare for something like this?
Good Lord.
Dr. Leslie.
There's
Yes.
so much to
I know.
start. I think one of the questions you ask is, well, how much do I need to prepare? Like, do I need a month's worth? Do I need, Personally, I like 3 months. That's my thing. I figure in 3 months, everything should get back to some semblance of normalcy. I have all of my important documents in a Ziploc. Okay. You got to have that, your passport, your birth certificate, your credit cards, your cash, everything in a Ziploc. It's waterproof, medications, 3 months worth. So get your 90-day supplies. I just spoke with a friend of mine in Florida, and she's in the middle of the storm. And I said, make sure you're sleeping with your shoes on and you're fully dressed.
Oh, I didn't think about that.
Don't put on your night tea, honey, and be laying down. Talking about you're going to get a nice little sleep in the rainstorm. No, boo-boo. I need you to be ready to go. So pack your backpack, your toiletries, clothing, underwear, and essentials. Okay, you're not going to pack a gown. So essentials, underwear, socks, shoes, sturdy shoes, no slippers, because during a hurricane, there's a lot of debris. If you got Timberland boots, these big, hard, heavy-duty boots, have those. Your raincoat. Now, I also have about 4 battery packs that I have charged up.
Oh, my goodness.
And so if one goes, I have another one. I have one of those portable where you plug in and they charge. You can run your car on it. I can run my house on it, parts of my house on it if I needed to. So the last thing I ever think about is food, because I'm just not into too much. But canned foods, but make sure you have a can opener. Because people go in and
Don't
buy
even
canned
think about
foods,
that.
and they have an electric can opener. Well, that's not going to work so well.
That's a good one.
So, dried foods that you can rehydrate, canned foods. But I would, if you have to get up and run, I would say your most important things would be your chargers and your documents. Everything else, I know, Dr. Dan, I'll stop and have someone else add.
That's great. And I'll say something too. We always think about when you say food that DoorDash is going to be there. Or Pizza Hut's going to be there. If you are maintaining or isolating, I'm thinking of quarantining, but if you are having to go to a shelter, you're told to evacuate. So is KFC and Pizza Hut. But I hope we're not eating there, to be honest. Let's go to Dr. Atoosa, because as a pediatrician, when we have small babies, when we have children that may be teenagers or have needs, how do they need to prepare?
Yeah, this is a great question. And the other thing I was going to highlight is whether you're going to be heading out on foot or by car, and if car evacuation is even going to be a possibility. Now, Dr. Sharon, Dr. Keisha, you live in Houston. I lived and trained in Houston through several tropical storms and hurricanes, and remember the flooding, and remember putting on knee-high boots and walking to the hospital, which was about 2 miles away, to help because there was no other way to get to the hospital. My car was flooded and out of commission, and there was no way to get anywhere. So if someone's car is going to get flooded, they have to be able to mobilize on foot. So if you live in a low-lying area that's flood prone, I think you should be ready to mobilize on foot if needed. And we talked about, Dr. Dan talked about last episode, and just now Dr. Leslie Ann mentioned having a go pack, a backpack that's packed that you can take and go. When you have small children, that makes it even more complex, right? You have to pack a couple of meals that are non-perishable for them. Now we have squeeze pouches of everything. So you could pack a few pouches of food for the kids, a few, granola bars and things that are like easily carried and eaten. So you should pack an extra large backpack that contains extra diaper supplies, extra food for the kids in case you need to evacuate to a holding area before they can get you housing in a disaster situation. But the key is actually to get out sooner rather than later. So right now, for instance, Tampa and areas in Central Florida have been told to evacuate now for 4 days. There are people now who are trying to evacuate now instead of like 2 days ago. If there's a way for you to evacuate sooner rather than later, before the storm surge hits, before roads get clogged, before there's collapse in critical systems, that's the best. And I think if you have small children, even more so, even though it's hard to disrupt their lives, it's hard to take them out of school if they're school age, but it's worth it to have the least disruption. If you have family a state away that you can drive to, or friends an hour and a half north that you can go to, somewhere out of the cone of maximum impact. Every hurricane has a range of area where they know that it's going to hit the hardest. And if you can get out of that area, that is actually the best thing you can do preemptively, rather than being stuck in a 7-hour road evacuation that would have otherwise taken an hour and a half if you had moved 2 days earlier. So that's what I would say, is to try to be preemptive when disaster is about to strike. But I've served overseas in disaster zones. Like after the tsunami in 2005, I was a young physician. So now almost 18 years ago, after the tsunami in Indonesia, and those people had minutes. They didn't have hours or days to prepare. So sometimes there's just no way to prepare. And that is why having a to-go pack, a go-to pack that has medications in it if you're on medicines, has emergency supplies, has a little first aid kit, has a couple of changes of clothes, having that always packed is important. And that was the lesson that I learned from my Houston days and from my overseas disaster relief days. And I do have my pack is right there. Maybe sometime we can open our packs and show what we carry. But I always have it packed in case I need to go immediately. And then I'm also thinking about my family that lives nearby and how I would help them evacuate. Because I live alone, but my family lives about 20 minutes away, my parents, my sister, and my nephew. So how would I help them evacuate? So coming up with plans with your family and close friends is a good way to also put your mind at ease that if disaster strikes, you have a plan of action.
Okay, great. Dr. Sharon, I want to go to you quickly just to add, because pregnant persons, important. You're in your last trimester, not even in your last trimester, and you're in the middle of a disaster like this. What should you recommend for them?
So I definitely recommend having a copy of your prenatal records, because you just don't know what's going to happen, where it's going to happen. So prenatal records, have all your medications with you. So have everything packed with you. Another thing that I usually would tell my patients in a situation like that is buy protein bars. Have some protein bars that are, protein bars and rice cakes. Usually quick snacks that can help, bridge that time period. Also, any emergency numbers at all that you have, and just a general, like what Dr. Leslie said, sleep in your clothes, have everything else, packed away, also your passport, all the important documents, so that when you need to be evacuated, you can quickly evacuate. Because, it's stressful enough just being pregnant, then add in this additional stress to me, is enough to put someone in labor. So just always be prepared and be ready, and have your doctor's number on hand. And if you can't get a hold of your doctor, 911. But have your prenatal records with you, and that will definitely help.
That's great. Yeah. And you said 911, and Dr. Dan kind of lifts his head, right? Emergency. But before we get to him, I want to finish a little bit with the pre-disaster, because I think he would be perfect to do our immediate response team. But try to avoid doing things that will lend you to the ER before, especially when you know it's limited. It's the same thing I mentioned with food. Don't assume now that the ambulances have the capability to get out on the roads if you cannot. A couple more statistics with the communities, because the communities are preparing. A lot of communities are preparing. Ours did not as much, right? I think now the power and light are working better at preparing for the next storm, but having detailed evacuation plans, they do. You can look online and see where your nearest shelter will be. And also, I wanted to let you know the statistics that a well-prepared community can reduce disaster-related injuries, right? Things flying and all of that, or getting injured, by up to 50%. Same thing with the healthcare systems. They prepare, and Dr. Dan will talk about in just a minute about how healthcare systems and ERs prepare before ahead of time in the interest that they even have to be a shelter, or they have patients that have to stay there as well. A statistic said that 80% of hospitals have updated emergency plans, but only 60% actually conduct community-wide disaster drills, something to think about. So now we're in the second part, immediate response, right? It's about to hit. Hurricane, tornado, what have you is about to hit. What do you recommend people do, and what is really happening in the ER in these emergency situations?
Yeah, thank you for that. Great points all around. One of the first things is let's put the facts and remove all the cap that's been going on. FEMA is an agency that has been doing a lot of work in this area, and they've gotten only better over the years after what happened with Katrina, and rest the souls of all those involved in those and many other disasters that have come. So there's a lot of rumors going around, so I just want to make sure we dispel that. The funds are going to the right place, and we don't need anybody kind of undermining their work and inhibiting the work that needs to be done to save other people's lives and people who have been displaced. So that's first thing. Hospitals start to prepare. They start to do the 4 S's, and everybody should be doing the 4 S's, which is basically figuring out what we call the staff, the supply, and surge capabilities, and the other stuff that you're going to need. So that's what they are doing, trying to create space, beds, availability. Now, if the hospital is in the hurricane eye of the storm or everything, they'll either hunker in place, and if they need to evacuate, they have to actually coordinate the transfer of those patients to other hospitals. Imagine that. People who are on life support, people who have to be helicoptered if the weather allows. So they have to anticipate this ahead of time and be watching the news, of course, and be in touch with the meteorologists and FEMA and the other agencies within the city. So the individual, it's about to hit, please follow FEMA guidelines. Whatever they recommend, you probably should do. If they say get out and you want to get out, you should probably get out, not try to hunker down if you can escape. A lot of people underestimate what is being said, and sometimes it doesn't come to pass, but the experts can only go by the model that they have. And if they say it's going to be 9-foot size storm, and you see what could happen with that. I mean, 2 feet of flooding will actually remove a car and take you off the road, can let a car go off, and you won't be able to have control of that. So people really have to take that into consideration. The other things, most important, your individual stuff, which my colleagues have mentioned with regards to the medication and all the things, but I worry about the people who have chronic diseases and chronic illnesses, who are what we call technology dependent. So children with special needs, people on dialysis who have to plug in their stuff, or who have cardiac monitors who have to plug into power. You should have already, it's not during the disaster that they should be figuring out where we need to go. Hospitals are great resources. I'm not trying to flood the hospitals because we don't want you to go to the hospitals. You should already been in contact with your Department of Health, and they have a plan where they'll actually have either a shelter, a bus, somewhere where you can plug in and you can kind of hunker down with you and your family member. So those are some of the things that people should have thought about already. So it might not help during this disaster because really it's in the eye of the storm now. But during other disasters, those are the things to anticipate. Worst comes to worst, you come to the hospital, you seek care where you can get care, and ride it out in the hospital or in that acute care facility that the government has provided. But these are the most important things that you can do and following the official guidelines to be prepared. You should also go to dhs.gov. You should go to the American Academy of Pediatrics. They have a Disaster Preparedness Advisory Council guideline on the tools for family members. I was one who served on that committee, and in my past life. And you have all those resources on those websites and pages, and I'm sure Dr. Keisha will have that at the end of this, but it's just a great resource for you to be aware. And people always forget about their meds, and that's the very important thing, because you can't get a doctor out of somewhere when there's a zone that you can't even get to. So I think those are the major things I would talk about. Go ahead, Dr. Will.
That's great. Yes, Dr. Williams.
I wanted to, because this question came up a lot, Dr. Dan, during Irma Maria, and that was insulin, because we had no power and there was no ice being made. We couldn't refrigerate insulin. And the reality is you don't have to. And so patients were encouraged to don't throw away your insulin, use it. And everyone did well. So I think that's, you can start off with the ice packs or whatnot and try your best. I have a portable refrigerator that you can plug into the car. But in an instance where you just don't have any power, you can use your insulin. And the other thing I wanted to say, and I forgot, in terms of evacuation, because right now we have just a lot of people on the road with nowhere going and running out of gas on the road. You have to plan way ahead. You know that the hurricane is coming. Plan to evacuate. Don't wait until evacuation orders, because then now everyone is trying to leave. And so it took one person 20 hours to get out of Florida back in 2017, ran out of gas, and there is no gas. So what do you do? So planning, stay ready so you don't have to get ready.
Yeah, there's another thing on that, and I'm sorry, you did bring that up. Insurance. When people, because of your medical insurance, but also just your regular insurance for housing, this is stuff later. So there's an aftermath, right? After the storm, the cavalry's come in. It's been 3 days or it's been a week. And now systems have now come in. FEMA, the National Guard, the local communities now coming back. The storm has come in. What do? Because you done lost all your stuff and you have to claim certain things. So make sure you have your insurance policies, your insurance policy information, all what Dr. Leslie alluded to before, that you put in that Ziploc bag. People tend to put it in the freezer to preserve it so you don't lose it and immediately you get it out, or you're safe wherever it is. Those are important documents. Well, everything, your ID, all that should be in a certain area, because when you need that information, it helps speed up the process if they're going to assist you financially and those types of things. So very important to think about that.
Very important. And I'll just recap everyone. We were talking about disaster preparedness. We talked about how to prepare. Then we talked about the immediate response with Dr. Dan. And I just want to give a couple statistics and then do the recovery quickly. During Hurricane Katrina, one of the things we talked about being ready, but communication, making sure coordination is right. During Hurricane Katrina, it was believed that due to some lack of coordination and communication, unfortunately, about 1,800 deaths and displacement could have been curtailed if that was the case. Right now, 90% of the United States counties do have access to mass notification system. So making sure that's together and the communication is there. Also, providing immediate medical care, all of that requires more people. So we have to also make sure that there's a ramped up availability of people during the emergency situation. For instance, during the Haiti earthquake, 2010, there was a 150% increase in demand for healthcare services within the first 24 hours. So it can't be the same staff. Like with COVID, it can't just be the bare minimum. We've got to be ready to act and be available. The last part that I wanted to talk about was this post-disaster recovery quickly. A couple of things. When we're talking about recovery, I'm glad you mentioned insurance. You have to be prepared for that. But in addition to that, mental health recovery is something that people don't think about. Long-term mental health challenges, including PTSD. Right now, the statistics with the American Psychological Association are that about 30% of disaster survivors are developing or have had PTSD. So that's real. I'm sure Dr. Dan can talk about that. In addition, rebuilding homes, hospitals, all of that. FEMA estimates that every dollar spent on a disaster mitigation saves about $6 in future related costs. So think about that too. Any final things you wanted to add on recovery, anyone? Dr. Leslie?
In terms of mental health, we talk a lot about the community, but it is important that we also consider first responders. And this was something that I addressed in the Virgin Islands and the islands surrounding, because our first responders, our physicians, ER, EMS, were stretched thin. And many had emergencies and deaths in their own family that they couldn't attend to because they were attending to the community at large. So I think that's something that we have to always put on the forefront. We cannot disregard the mental health of our physicians. And so Dr. Thema Bryant actually came to the Virgin Islands. I supported her to come to the Virgin Islands and conduct a workshop to start that healing process for our first responders, our police officers, our firemen, our teachers, because these are the ones, our doctors, nurses, these are the ones who are seeing it. So I wanted to make sure that when we talk about mental health and post-hurricane, post-disaster, that we consider the people who are on the front lines all the time.
Great point, Dr. Leslie, great point. One more thing with the post-recovery is we have a lot of water, flooding, things getting damaged, is the infections. So we know waterborne illnesses, GI, gastrointestinal, or the stomach, the gut illnesses can run rampant, and many people can get sick quick because of that. Also, mold exposure. If you have a lot of water damage afterwards, we have to worry about respiratory issues that can happen. We have to worry about chemical burns and also carbon monoxide, people using the generators as well. So those are also part of the recovery effort. Dr. Dan, is there anything you wanted to add about that?
No, well, yes, since I responded. So the carbon monoxide, I wanted to mention that earlier, but that's during the acute phase more so when they're running generators, or even sometimes in recovery if they're at a shelter or some other place where they have those. So being able to monitor that, making sure they work, and the generators outside of the household or the shelter, very important to watch and monitor that. But I think all the rest of the things are dead on, are important things that we need to talk about. So thank you.
Great. It was very important. I thank you all for being part of this conversation. We talked about the disaster recovery. We right now, as we speak, are in the midst of a hurricane in Florida, and we're looking, to be abreast on what's going on. So stay abreast on what's going on, but don't let it take over your time to where you are getting stressed about it, because your mental health is important as well. So thank you all for being part of this conversation, and until next time. Thank you for tuning in to The Medical Collective. We hope today's episode has left you with valuable insights and a new perspective on healthcare. Don't forget, follow us on social media for more updates and behind-the-scenes content. I'm Dr. Keisha Davis, and it's been a pleasure to share this time with you. Stay healthy, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next episode, where medicine continues to meet real life. Please note that the content provided in the Medical Collective podcast, including text, graphics, images, and other material, is for informational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are solely those of the individual authors and guests and do not represent those of the Medical Collective, its staff, and any affiliated entities. The appearance of content on the podcast does not imply an endorsement. Neither the host, Dr. Keisha Davis, the co-host, or any guest of the podcast bear responsibility for the accuracy of the content provided or the use of information received through the podcast. Reliance on any information provided by the Medical Collective podcast